All right. So thanks again for joining us. As you may have known from previous calls, my name is Rachel Sample. I'm with IHCDA. And today we are going to be talking about what to expect this year on the internal renewal application and give you some basics about COC and kind of what's coming next. So we are going to review what the requirements are for the COC renewal process as HUD expects us to conduct this process. We're also going to talk over the expectations that are a part of IHCDA, procedures and things that we're required to do, as well as the Continuum of Care Board. So there's a number of different requirements that we have in our process, as well as what HUD requires that we want to be clear about. I'm also going to talk a little bit about what to expect in 2023, especially as it comes to your annual performance report data or APR data. That information that we request from there is something that hopefully is readily available to you in your homeless management information client track system. And if you have any questions about that, we can certainly spend some time discussing it and I'll answer them the best we can. We can also decide to maybe schedule some separate time with our HMIS team to maybe dive a little deeper if we need to. I also like to open this up as an opportunity to provide any feedback on the process itself. Last year was my first year conducting the IRPA, as it's called, IRPA, Internal Renewal Program Application Process, and certainly tried to do my best there, but always looking for feedback if you have any concerns there. Also an opportunity to ask any questions about what we know so far. Like I said, we don't actually have the tool itself yet finalized. We're going to be working on the board committee, the funding and resources committee, to do that yet this spring. But we have been working hard with the team here with the HMIS team in particular, and with the planning team around the NOFO to come up with some opportunities to make improvements and clarify, what we can and things like that. So would appreciate any feedback or any questions at that time as well. So let's hop into just talking about requirements and implications of those requirements as it relates to how you renew your grant through the COC program. I am going to start by just kind of defining some terms. That's because we're going to start using some of this terminology pretty consistently in this presentation and in future COC program NOFO and IRPA materials. So would appreciate you having the opportunity to review and understand these terms as we start using them. The first term I want to define is the grant inventory worksheet. This is essentially an Excel spreadsheet that HUD puts together that is a record of all the grants that are eligible for renewal in the competition. We're going to talk a little bit in just a moment about the difference between grants and projects in a moment, but just know that HUD, in their infinite wisdom, actually asks us to tell them what they fund, and we have to confirm that for them, or they will sometimes mess it up. And it was a big learning curve for me last year, as it was the first time I'd really engaged with the GIW. My role previously in other positions with the NOVO had not really touched that product. So it's a very interesting thing that we do every year, but it's usually very early on in the process. Before the NOFO comes out, you see information from us coming out asking you to check it, and that we, if we need to submit corrections, that we do that in a timely manner. A reallocation of funding is when we shift funds either in whole or in part from an existing project to a new project. A new project could be any number of types of projects. When you reallocate money, you can do that voluntarily or involuntarily, meaning voluntarily would mean that you come to the COC board and say, I've reviewed my grant expenditures and realized I have more money in my grant than I can expend. And at that time, we can work with you on removing some grant dollars from your grant so that when you renew it, it's for a slightly less amount. This can be helpful if you are having a history of underspending on the grant. And we'll talk later about policies related to reallocation, but you can also be involuntarily reallocated if your project, consistently underspends and does not make any corrections, like, voluntarily reallocating to address that, or by, improving expenditures on the grant so that the grant is more fully utilized. The next term is consolidation. Consolidation is when we combine two projects of the same type into one grant. So it can be it's technically two grants into one grant. So apologies, I'm using a little bit of confusing terminology, but we have had some folks in the last couple of years take advantage of this. This is an administrative help to some agencies, depending on how they run their programs, and for them to be able to take two separately awarded contracts and combine them into one grant. I will say the only other caveat there is if you are a receiving funding as an IHCDA subrecipient and a HUD subrecipient direct, that you can't consolidate when you're not being awarded the funding through the same entity. So it does have to be the same project type. So if you are a PSH agency and you have two PSH grants, you could consolidate them into one. It doesn't matter if there's a subpopulation specialty under one. It doesn't prevent you from doing that. I think the main thing is that, from the board's perspective, they want to make sure that we don't lose maybe the opportunity for folks to access services, for example, in a domestic violence program, that you'd still be serving survivors, even though you may be consolidated with another one of your grants. The next term is an expansion. This is when a new project is added or a new grant is added that adds funding to an existing grant. Expansions are done as new projects. So when we have that new project application process come through, you can apply to add money to a grant. The board typically wants to see that you're adding units and services to a grant and not just services. But we can certainly talk about, if you are looking at your grants and you're needing to add services, could certainly talk about how we do that in a thoughtful way through an expansion project as we conduct the competition. The next is the renewal application, or IRPA, as we call it here at Balance of State, IRPA. This is the process for renewal COC projects or grants to competitively apply for the renewal of their grant. There are some expectations we're going to talk about from HUD on what that process looks like, but this is something we do every year. As long as there's a NOFA, we're going to do an IRPA every year. So there have occasionally been talks about whether or not HUD might ever go to a 2-year cycle, but I'll believe it when I see it. So until we have that, we will be doing this IRPA, this renewal application process every year. So what are these other words here? Well, first of all, of course, we have the NOFO. The NOFO is an acronym that means Notice of Funding Opportunity, formerly Notice of Funding Application, or NOFA. This is really HUD's process for applying for the COC funds. So we, as a Balance of State, as I've mentioned previously, are submitting the materials on behalf of the Continuum of Care and all the subrecipients or direct recipients. And we do that through the full NOFO process. Not only are we submitting your individual project applications through a ranking system, but we also submit a large collaborative application that I talked about last week. And all of that together allows us to renew our projects and our grants. DV bonus. So for those of you who are newer or maybe aren't familiar, this has been a part of the NOFO competition for the last they didn't conduct it during the pandemic because they just renewed everybody, but it's been around for about 4 years now, or 4 competition cycles, I guess is probably a more accurate way of saying it. This is a dedicated funding stream inside the competition that is only for domestic violence projects and only for certain project types that HUD allows in the competition. In some years, they will allow for domestic violence coordinated entry. Some years they will allow for domestic violence rapid rehousing and TH to RRH. Sometimes they don't allow for DVCE or some of those other ones. It's up to their discretion on whether or not those would be ones you could renew, one you could newly apply for. Once a DV project is funded through the NOFO under the bonus, it becomes a part of the portfolio. So it's fully integrated as a regular renewing grant that is expected to, go through the process that we go through. It doesn't continue to compete for funding separately, but in the NOFO process itself, it's actually a set aside amount of money that is for domestic violence. Those projects are applying all across the country and are competing with one another, so it's highly competitive funding. Our ranking is our list of projects or grants that are our priority of what we're requesting to fund. So last year, I think once it was all said and done, we had, with all new projects and renewing projects, we had about 78, I think, 78 grants that were submitted in that ranking, so 1 through 78. This included all of our supportive housing, our rapid rehousing, transitional housing to rapid rehousing, one transitional project, HMIS projects, coordinated entry projects. All of those are in one big ranking that's submitted to HUD. The only part of the COC funding that is not ranked is the planning grant. The planning grant is per HUD regulations not ranked. It's you request that funding and you are either granted it or not granted it if you fail to meet requirements, which fortunately for IHCDA and Balance of State has not happened. Each of those, as you know, all of this is defined as far as what you can pay for and all of that inside the HUD COC program interim rule. And you can find that information on HUD's website if you're not sure what does a coordinated entry grant pay for, or what does a PSH grant pay for, and so on and so forth. So finally, the collaborative application, as I mentioned last week, is the detailed application of COC activities and achievements that we submit to HUD on behalf of the Balance of State. And that ranking and that collaborative application both have to be submitted to HUD in order for us to have a completed NOFO application to HUD. So those are both required pieces. They are completely separate in the eSNAP system. If you're familiar with that system, if they're their own distinct things, and we submit them each year on behalf of the COC. So I'm going to try and not confuse these terms, but just want to quickly say something, because we do have a few grants that have multiple projects under them. And I want to just specify in particular for our folks who are DV bonus folks, which we had a separate call and we had a chance to chat about this. But a couple of our older grants actually are multi-project grants as well. So just to clarify, because as we talk about some of these things like ranking and things like that, it may be confusing if you are somebody who is a subrecipient of a project in a grant with other projects. So first of all, just to clarify, a grant from the COC grant is HUD allocated to a single agency or group of agencies to complete activities to meet the requirements of a project type. All the grants are listed in the grant inventory or GIW worksheet. So when you go in to look at the GIW, if you were, let's say, a part of our COC2 grant, you're not going to see your individual project listed. Or if you're a part of our DVTH to RRH project, if you saw that GIW, you wouldn't see your individual project, you'd see the bigger grant. So you're probably not going to have as much of an intensive review of that. We're going to be looking more intentionally internally at IHCDA to make sure those are correct. But just be aware that, as if you are somebody who meets into that category, it's not that this stuff doesn't apply to you. It just looks just a little bit different, and we're happy to answer any questions you need to about that. All projects under a grant must be the same type. So you're not going to have an agency or a group of agencies have a PSH and RRH projects together under one grant. And grants can have multiple projects, as I mentioned, a couple of examples. Again, just please note that as I talk about grants and projects, there's going to be some things that apply differently to you. As a recipient or subrecipient of COC program money, you have to fill out an IRPA no matter if you are a project or a grant or both. Everybody does one, even if they are a part of a larger grant, and I can explain what that means and the implications of that later in the presentation. But everybody does it. If you have a project, you do it, but you may not be your own grant when we go into to renew your project. So as an example here, what does this mean that's different? Well, I'm giving an example here where both of these are subrecipients of IHCDA. So there is another type here where it might be HUD that says Lafayette Transitional Housing. And they obviously are also a grant and a project in that case, or Beacon, or another one of our partners that contract directly with HUD. In this case, you see we have a grant here, our DV bonus, or our grant here, South Shore Commons. And in this case, they are a single entity that we contract with to provide the housing and services. And in this case, we have multiple agencies underneath that. So we have a few of those grants that are out there, not a ton, but just want to provide that clarification for you. If you are somebody who fits in that category, you still got to do an IRPA. These are the people who all do IRPAs, and you do it for every project you have, not just one for all of your grants or projects. You do one distinct one for each one, which I know is a joy, right? It's fun. Okay, so what is the renewal process? I talked about this a couple weeks ago, but just a refresher. First, you need to, review and make sure that that grant inventory worksheet is correct and submit those corrections to us so that we can make sure that what is listed for you inside eSnaps is right. Because whether or not we're going in and confirming your eSnaps or you're going in and confirming your eSnaps, the GIW will only be what is in eSnaps, and vice versa. eSnaps isn't going to have what's not in the GIW. As you're preparing for this next year's competition, it would be most helpful, though not a requirement, for you to let the IHCDA team know so that we can inform the board and the Funding and Resources Committee if we have planned consolidations. If you are planning a project transition, which we can talk about if people have questions, but it's essentially changing a project from one type to another. Lonnie can tell you all about those joys if you want to ask questions, because she did it last year. Or an expansion. So you are applying for new money, and you wanna do that. The other thing that you could do, and I'm going to discuss this at the very end, is talk to us about reallocation. If you are underspending on your grant and you've kind of explored all your options to increase that utilization, and you've decided, we planned something that ended up implementing differently, and now we need to change this grant a little bit, you can come talk to us about it, and we can plan for that in the competition. Next, you're going to participate in the IRPA process, or the internal renewal application and competition process. So we use the term competition because HUD does require this to be competitive, and I'll talk more about what that means, but it really is something that we ask everybody to do for every project, and you have to do it every year. As long as HUD's doing the competition, we're going to have an IRPA. And then finally, making sure that you review your eSnaps materials, your match commitments, so that, as your grant maybe adjusts, because let's say we have an increase in FMR and suddenly your grant goes up, $3,000. We're obviously going to need you to update the match information that's inside eSnaps so that that information accurately reflects the financial requirements that the grant is expecting, since COC does have that 25% match. If you are a subrecipient of IHCDA, we work with you on this. If you are direct HUD, you go in and do this yourself. Every year we have Howard complete a presentation for us that describes many of the internal eSnaps system processes and procedures and steps. We will absolutely do that again this year. That presentation is not gonna, go away because we did this. This is just a very high level overview for you, so you're aware of the steps of that renewal process. If there are mistakes in that eSnaps application, that could put you at risk for your renewal. So for example, if you went in and reviewed and you didn't realize there was an FMR adjustment and you never changed your match, and let's say you're short on match, there could be a problem. We go in as a team, Howard in particular, since he has that capacity and why we bring him on as a consultant, he goes and looks at everything that we're putting in to make sure we don't have inconsistencies like this, but nobody's perfect. And so that's one reason why it's important for you to kind of take that responsibility to go in and check so that you can make those changes, especially because, we're not going to know that the Lilly Endowment Foundation is going to, give you this additional money, or we're not going to make things up, I guess is the nicer way of saying it. So just please, go into eSnaps when we ask you to, or if you are a subrecipient of ours, when we send you information, please review it and check it so that it's updated and correct. Okay, so again, real quickly, we're going to review and submit the GIW and tell us about your corrections. You're going to make sure that if you are planning on reallocating or consolidating or expanding, you let us know. That's not a requirement. It's just really helpful for us so we kind of know what to expect. You're going to prepare and complete the IRPA. You're going to review your scoring report. So after you do your IRPA, we review and score all of them, and we send a report back to you. You can review that and appeal. The basic process for an appeal is you email me. And actually, there were several of you last year who helped us catch a couple of math errors. So it's absolutely a part of the process for you to say, hey, when I add these points up, I get something different. So that's absolutely part of the process. And again, we can't be perfect, but we try our best. So as that's appropriate, the first step is to just let us know that you think that there's a math error, and we're happy to take a look. And like I said, I think I made 2 or 3 corrections last year from people catching stuff like that, which was great. We want this to be right and to be fair. You want to go in when the time comes, when HUD opens up that competition, and go into eSnaps. You're going to, correct anything. If there's some sort of, maybe something really substantial change, like you used to have a a partner that you had an MOU with and you wrote all about them in your narrative at one point and now you don't do that anymore, you can go in and change that. Most people don't, but it's nice for the narrative to reflect what you're actually doing, because that's what HUD has, HUD thinks you're doing. So it's good for us to do that. What you can't do are make substantial updates to your budget through the NOFO process. So if you decide you want to move a bunch of money out of rental assistance and into services, this is not the time or place to do it. You can reach out to us, to your field office rep, on how to do a budget modification, but we cannot do budget modifications through the competition process. If you've done a recent budget modification, that'll be when you want to help us out by checking that GIW, and we'll do our best to make sure everything lines up and matches what we have on file, and making sure that that's all submitted correctly to HUD back in the GIW too. And then finally, you want to, at the end-ish, it's required for us to do it at least 15 days before we are submitting our application, or from the day the NOFOs due, because we're usually submitting around the same time. They don't give us a lot of time. We send out an email that says, hey, all of our projects have been ranked. Here is our ranking. Go ahead and check it out. And you can go in and review that. And again, if you look at this and you say, Rachel, when I emailed you earlier and told you my ERPA was scored wrong, I'm still seeing my old score on the ranking. Like, this needs to be corrected. And again, we'll review it. And if it's appropriate for a simple correction to be made, then we'll go ahead and do it. If it needs to be a more substantial appeal, we can walk you through what that process looks like. Fortunately, at Balance Estate, we are not super big on like very formalized, like by day 3, you must submit, this specific sheet of paper. The process that we have laid out is fairly conversational and appropriate for addressing a problem, and allows you to make your case as needed and have it reviewed by the board if it reaches that level. And to be clear, HUD actually requires us to have an appeals process. So speaking of HUD requirements for renewal competitions and the COC competition overall, we must have a competitive process for renewal projects. So I wish it was as easy as just saying, everybody's doing a great job, everybody's working hard. Here is our list of all of our projects that we love and we want them to stay. Unfortunately, HUD doesn't allow us to do it that way. We do have to have a competitive process to determine what the ranking will be. We have to use objective criteria as a part of the tool. It doesn't have to be every single question in the ERPA tool, but there have to be a certain percentage of questions that are considered objective. There have to be a certain percentage of questions that are based upon performance data, meaning HMIS data, and how we determine what performance is based on COC expectations. We set those. But primarily, again, as I was kind of mentioning last time, HUD gives us incentives to behave a certain way. So some of the things that they ask us about in the competition when we're completing that collaborative application are telling us, did you evaluate your projects this way? You get points if you did. And so it kind of leads you down a certain path. So those objective criteria, those performance criteria, and they're going to look for things in our renewal competition tool that is supportive of federal priorities. If we were not evaluating projects on Housing First in any way, HUD would have raised some eyebrows to that. How are they making sure that projects that they're renewing are Housing First? Why aren't they asking any questions about that, for example? Because it is a competition, things have to create a score, and that score should inform then the ranking, so that when you're ranking projects, it is a core component that the projects that are in the ranking have been scored. The COC can set aside projects for set aside policies to make certain projects not scored. And we can talk about that if people have questions. But for example, HMIS projects are not scored in the ERPA process. Their project type is very different than a housing project. And the COC board evaluates HMIS differently through a charter and a meeting of those expectations, as opposed to using the ERPA. So they're protected in the sense that they're not scored, and that the policies that we have set forth keep those infrastructure projects in the higher priority for funding, to make sure that we don't lose funding to keep our data system open, for example. Again, the process must be transparent and allow for appeals. So it's not okay for me to take your application, review it, make up a random score and send it back to you, and then never allow you to talk to me about it, or any of the members of our team who work on the IRPA, including the Funding and Resources Committee, who also score applications. Ranking must be approved by the board. So ultimately, the ranking that is created through the competitive process is reviewed and approved by the COC board. And then if in some bad situation where we can't come to a decision on what's going on with the project. Let's say you submitted a new project and the COC board, reviewed it and decided, or excuse me, the Funding and Resources Committee reviewed it and decided not to recommend it for funding. The COC board agreed to that and didn't include it in the ranking. And you had gone through the process of appealing through our system and our process all the way through and it didn't get that. You could then go directly to HUD and apply. That's the only way projects can apply directly to HUD. And I'm not talking about those of you who are direct recipients. I'm talking about a new project literally like sending their own individual application to HUD. It's allowable, but you have to demonstrate that you followed the appeals process and been denied that appeal through the COC competition at your local level. So it's literally written in every NOFA that this is something that you can do if you're at an impasse and we can't come to an agreement about having your project included and can't get on the same page about it. So it's definitely possible. I've never seen it happen, but HUD does allow for it. And we have to allow for it as the COC. So some of the board requirements that are outlined either in board policies or in specific recommendations that the board has made. First, that the projects are meeting performance expectations and monitoring requirements. So in addition to the COC IRPA process, if, for example, a project were to be monitored by HUD or IHTDA and to be found completely devoid of following policies in some pretty significant way under the COC program, the board could make a decision because it can do that, as a part of, being the supporter and recommender of funding. They could work through a process where potentially you might not be ranked because of that deficiency. Again, that's not going to be a surprise to anybody, but it is a part of what can happen if somebody is so deficient that they are not meeting requirements, that there will be a process that would be worked through where essentially a renewal project would not be included in the ranking. There are policies that we're going to talk briefly about in a little bit that explain some of the things that happen during the competition. These policies are reviewed, updated, and approved every year. But one of the most important things to know is that board members, whether they are committee members who are recommending funding to the board or board members themselves, they must adhere to a conflict of interest policy. So anybody who has a financial interest in an organization or a subsidiary organization, anything like that, cannot vote on funding related to the COC program. This has always been a practice, but it has been truly codified in some recent board policy updates so that it's listed in multiple places and really clarifies any potential conflict of interest risks that could come up. Just a couple of things to know is, like I said, the COC board processes that, people are not conflicted when they review for funding. Projects are reviewed by Funding and Resources and ranked, and that ranking is provided as a recommendation to the board for approval. And not only is a project's ranking reviewed, but their spending is also reviewed. So in situations where we have somebody who's significantly underspending, and we'll talk about the reallocation policy if we need to, we may work with the project to voluntarily or involuntarily reallocate some money, and that'll be done through the committee process at Funding and Resources. And then, like I said, all of that funding amounts and the ranking itself are provided as a recommendation to the board, and the board votes on them. So just a couple of things to know. As I mentioned, the COC board does operate with a conflict of interest policy. And that's something that has, like I said, existed in practice in some places of policy for a long time, but it's really been elevated inside recent board governance updates. So that's really great that the board is recognizing how, times change and we really need to get things in writing in multiple places and not just in COC NOFO policy. But there's also a policy on ranking and reallocation I'm going to talk about in a minute. And there, as another policy, is technically the actual scoring tool itself is considered a policy by HUD, because that is the policy of how we're scoring you. So that document itself, that detailed scoring document that you guys may remember from last year, that you're going to see another version of later this year, that's actually considered a policy document according to HUD. And then we have an appeals policy. And I've kind of generally referred to what that appeals policy is. I'll post a link here at the end of our discussion with where you can locate all these policies, but they're voted on and reviewed every year. They're always a part of how this process works, and it's a requirement that we follow them when we make decisions. So the ranking and reallocation policy is the one that has the most implications for most people in the competition. First, like I said, the ranking and reallocation policy says that everybody new and renewal projects, it's projects itself that are actually ranked to start with, are ranked except for projects that are operating less than 1 year and projects that are essential to COC operations. That is, for example, when our DV bonus subrecipients came on, we had a period of time where they were ranked, but they were not ranked upon their performance. They weren't competitively ranked. Those essential projects to COC are the coordinated entry grants, the HMIS grants, and like I mentioned earlier, planning grant is not included in this because planning grant is not ranked, but it's also considered an infrastructure style grant according to HUD. Projects that apply for DV bonus in particular are ranked as a part of the overall ranking, but they're actually scored separately by HUD. And it's a completely separate decision-making process by HUD standards for whether or not a new project would be selected. So the way HUD selects new projects is based upon a score that's created through an equation that I'm not going to get into. But the DV bonus projects, they actually are in their own little ranking. And new projects that are brought on are ranked nationally. And DV bonus projects are brought on are ranked nationally amongst other DV bonus. So they're kind of like separate pots of money, but those new projects are in our ranking. But when it comes to selection time, they're actually put up against every other new project that is being applied for by HUD, and in some cases renewal projects, depending on how things are ranked. A fun fact, if you did not know this, if you are a project that has had a history of underspending on your grant and you would like to voluntarily reallocate funding, this can be any amount of funding. So if maybe you've got, $4,000 or $5,000, even you're not spending, your project automatically gets 15 bonus points in the ranking and review process. So if you are, at all concerned about your performance, as we talk about what the rest of these questions are going to look like this year, and you want to do some things to maybe incentivize how your score might look, and you've got some money that you're not spending, and you're not going to continue to not spend, you could voluntarily reallocate and receive 15 points. According to our current ranking and reallocation policy, projects must score a minimum of 65% of the highest points that are scored in the IRPA to be eligible for automatic renewal. Projects that do not score 65% of points will be contacted and asked to provide performance improvement information and rationale for why they're having difficulty reaching performance benchmarks. So in a situation, and again, if you have looked at our IRPA tool that we send out in our detailed instructions in the past, you might remember this information. But if we have 100 points in our IRPA, anybody who scores 65 and above would automatically have no issue renewing. They're going to be included without any delay. They're already in there. If you scored 64 or 50 or 43, we'd reach out to you and say, hey, you failed to meet the threshold of 65% of points, please let us know kind of what's going on, and we give you a form to fill out. As it stands in the past, as I know it, this has typically been sufficient for the Funding and Resources Committee to determine that they'll go ahead and then recommend a project for renewal down the line, but it's not a guarantee. It's completely, once we have that performance improvement plan, it's up to Funding and Resources on whether or not they'd recommend that to the board or not. In the cases where we have offered bonus points in the IRPA, so last year there was actually up to 125 points. That means that the threshold is not 65 out of 100, But whatever 65% of 125 is, I'm not going to do the math right now. So it's the highest points that any project has received, and it's not available points, it's points received. So those of you who are out there getting 125 points, you know who you are. Congratulations, you're doing amazing work. Everybody is doing amazing work, though. I recognize that, data's not going to tell every story, but we do have some partners out there who will score every single bonus point and every single required point. So again, if you are concerned as you complete your ERPA or are looking at your data, think about what an extra 15 points might do to support your process of renewal. It's not a requirement for you to voluntarily reallocate. You don't have to do that, but it's something that would give you some extra points if that was something you were worried about. Oh, and just to be clear, it's 15 points in the ERPA 65% of the ERPA. It's not that 15 points doesn't add on to the most amount of points that you could get on the ERPA, because the ERPA is different than the reallocation policy, which is what allows you for those bonus points. So the other two things to know is that a project that is being renewed has to expend at least 75% of their funding. I'll tell you about what year we're looking at when we talk about this in just a moment, but if you are not expending 75% of your project award, the specific award that you have, not if you are part of a larger award, 70, you don't get bonus points for other people spending more and you spending less, right? It's your specific project must expend 75% of funding. And if you're not hitting 75%, if you're at 74.9, this is how the policy is written, failure to do so will result in 10% of your award being reallocated. Projects that do not spend 50% of their funding will have 25% of their funds reallocated. If you were to decide to do a voluntary reallocation, these policies would not apply because you're already kind of coming forward and trying to right size your grant a little bit. But in general, the process is that you are going to be reallocated. Now, again, if we reach out to you and we're having this conversation and you are able to explain that you've got a new plan, you're addressing the lack of expenditures, the Funding and Resources Committee does still reserve the right to, decide not to reallocate a project. But the way the policy is written, it allows them to just automatically determine, yeah, you're going to be reallocated. If they don't have any information about what's going on, that may be their decision. If they have more information, they might decide otherwise. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But that is the policy. And for this year, I'll talk about it again later, but I'll say it right now. For this year, we are going to be looking at expenditures fiscal year 2020. That's because there were no awards. Like, everybody is closed out of 2020. There's nobody that hasn't spent all of their 2020 money. And there are some people who still have tiny amounts of 2021 left. I'll double check that before we actually have conversations with anybody about what's going on with their money. But if you have underspent in the past and now are back on track, that could be a part of the rationale you provide to the committee. On how you've made improvements, and that could be a part of, the information we're providing to them as we move forward with the competition process. So just kind of want to briefly visualize for those of you who are a part of larger grants, how ranking works as a project versus how it works as a grant. So we rank all projects, and then when we submit the ranking to HUD, it's only grants. We don't submit the entire ranking list of all projects because HUD doesn't know about projects, they know about grants, right? So here's a visualization of the ranking. The way our policies work, it says that if an agency has a project that is a part of a larger grant, then the score and how that grant will be ranked will be based upon the highest performing project in that grant. So I'm going to show you some examples here. In this case, we have Housing Agency A. They have one project under one grant. B has one project under one grant. C has one project under one grant. And then we have this, for example, how we have some of our DV bonus projects. DV Agency has a TH to RRH project. This is under a larger grant, so it's not a grant and project together, it's just a project, and so on and so forth. You'll see then, look at this agency down here. They have a project under a larger grant. So as you'll see, when we look at how this would work in the ranking that we submit to HUD, DV Agency THRH2 will get ranked up here with project 1. RRH Agency 2 will be ranked with RRH Agency 1. Everything else will stay the same. Um, yep, we can talk about that. Thanks, Kelly. Everything else will remain the same. These are just going to get bumped up, and you'll see what that does and how it looks. So when we actually submit to HUD, and granted, this isn't how it looks to HUD. They just see the big grant. They don't see the little awards. But you'll see how you've still got agency A, agency B, agency C, and then, here's our two projects together under our bigger grant. And there they are again on our bigger grant. And what it does here is it then brings up all the other agencies below it. So when you are provided with information about your score and your rank, just realize if you are an agency that is a project under a multiple project grant, you could benefit from having somebody else on that grant who is performing better than your project. It's just kind of, to be quite honest, it's a way of making sure that there is some clear way we're submitting a ranking in without making a lot of complicated math decisions. So this is the policy that the board approved last year. I don't anticipate them changing their minds about this, but like I said, this is an opportunity for you all to express any concerns or ask any questions, provide any feedback, and I would be happy to pass that information on to our committee and our board as the time moves forward. So Kelly asked a question about reallocation and COVID-19. So what I will say is that if you are somebody who has struggled to spend down your project, or if you have a single grant and project together, that would be part of the rationale that you would be providing to the Funding and Resources Committee when they ask you about your funding utilization. If you're not hitting, if you are above 75%, we're not going to ask you for any information. We're going to assume that you're kind of on track or you're making improvements to get to 100%. The goal that is listed out in the policy is that everyone is at 90%. I mean, obviously we'd all love for everyone to be at 100, but that's difficult. It's difficult to spend 100% of your money, but the goal is to be at 90. That's what's written in the policy. So if you're above 75, we're not going to contact you. We're not going to reach out. We're not going to ask for any rationale. If you are below this mark, if you're between these two, we will let you know what the policy is and ask for more information. If you are below this mark of 50, same thing will apply. We will reach out to you, let you know the policy, and want to have a conversation with you about what's going on. So that is to say, Kelly, you're offered an opportunity to provide that rationale that you could explain. It's COVID, it's lack of units, I mean, whatever the rationale might be, and the board will consider that as a part of their decision. And I can tell you last year that was some conversations that were had and people still wanting to give agencies time to recover from the pandemic, knowing that staffing continues to be an issue. All of that was heavily discussed at the Funding and Resources Committee and was involved in the ultimate decision about any agencies that were going to be reallocated. So I will say they're very open-minded and want to hear that feedback. That's why we offer that chance to provide that information to them. I can't guarantee it, but it's your chance to provide that to them. It's ultimately their choice. Okay, so just as a final reminder, I think one of the things that can be a little bit confusing is people mistake decision being made by the board as a final decision when ultimately HUD decides. So, Funding and Resources reviews IRPAs and scores them. They also review new project application and scores them, and they score them. They then develop and approve a ranking that is inclusive of all new and renewal projects, and they recommend that ranking to the board. And the COC board, and Funding and Resources is already a non-conflicted group, but only non-conflicted board members of the COC board will review and approve the ranking. And then that ranking, along with that collaborative application, is submitted to HUD. They review it, they review all the project applications, and they make the decision about projects in the end. So it is possible that a project that is submitted to HUD anywhere in the ranking, if there was some egregious problem with the application that, like I said, if you didn't update your match information and somehow we didn't catch it, HUD could come back and say, we're not going to renew this project. They can't meet the match requirement. I don't know that that's ever happened, but it's possible. So that's why we want you to take a good look at what's in eSnaps to make sure it's right. So what do we expect this year in our IRPA process? Crossing fingers, we will be releasing it in May. And as of right now, I think we're still on track for an early to mid-May release. I don't want to say April and not hit that. So May feels very comfortable for us at this stage. The IRPA tool itself has not been approved by this the COC Funding and Resources Committee. So I can't say for sure on anything that I'm about to present to you, but I can tell you what we've been discussing in our planning meetings and what we have done in the past that we will likely continue to do again this year. We're going to keep asking you questions about housing first. We're going to keep asking you questions about performance measures. We are likely to be introducing some equity and representation questions that are going to be a little bit different than what we've asked in the past, based upon some things we're seeing from HUD and some trends that we are seeing nationally in different ways to ask these questions, as opposed to kind of the checkbox of, yes, I have a board member, and the checkbox of this person has lived experience kind of thing. And then there will be attachments to your IRPA. And I'm going to talk about the attachments in a couple of minutes. But in addition to answering questions, we're going to ask you to attach a couple of extra documents. The one thing I will say is we've been doing a lot of work inside the grants team that I oversee at IHCDA to be looking intentionally at where we are asking you for duplicate documentation. In some cases, we have to do it because of timing, where, if something renews at a certain time of year and we have to ask for it again, it's just part of what we have to do in order to execute a contract or something like that. But if we already have your UEI number on file because you are a renewal project or you've had ESG money, I don't anticipate us needing to ask for information like that. And I know that it's, for some of you, you might have it memorized. I know not some of these things are fairly easy for you to get, and they're not hard. I'm not talking about, everything in the application, we're just going to borrow from somebody else. But some things that we've asked for before, we may be getting in different ways as opposed to asking you to attach them. And that's for a number of reasons. But I think part of it is just recognizing that we've got a lot of data over here. Unfortunately, we don't always have the easiest ways of keeping it together because we don't have fancy technology systems yet. Crossing fingers, we might soon. But we want to, reduce burden on us and you to review and attach a bunch of documents we may or may not need because we already have them. Can't promise everything, but it is something we're taking a hard look at this year. Okay, so performance measures. That's what could that mean, right? Let's walk through that just real briefly. So the performance measures, if you're familiar with the annual performance report, are these buckets, and maybe you already know. I'll walk through some of these separately, particular to the APR in just a moment, but just so you're aware. We're going to be looking at HMIS data quality. Data quality is really important to the accuracy of what we're submitting to HUD and making sure that we are understanding of the needs and the effectiveness of the response we have to homelessness. Data quality is important no matter you're a COC grant or an ESG or, Rachel's private foundation grant that has decided to use HMIS. It's always, data quality is always important. You cannot know you can't know anything about the system if the quality is poor. So I think any of you who are the financial people in your agency probably know that, right? If you have bad data in, bad data out kind of situation, right? We're going to be looking at exits to permanent housing, meaning I exited or I maintained my permanent housing. So if I'm a supportive housing project, people remained in their unit or moved on effectively to another permanent housing location, or for rapid rehousing, they successfully exited to a permanent housing location. The exits to homelessness are unknown. So again, these are no different than the questions we asked last year, with the exception that they're going to be much clearer to understand, and we'll walk through why in a moment. But we are going to continue to ask people about when we have had a truly unsuccessful exit. We know that we have times where people, are going to temporarily live with family or friends, or they're going to go to jail or rehab or die. The intention is not to count those people. We're talking about people who truly had an unsuccessful exit. You probably can think of these, depending on the size of your program, 2, 4, 6, 8 people who this happened to as you think about it, or people who exited our program and we don't know where they went, because ultimately that's a data quality issue. And if we're using that exits to unknown a lot, that's something that needs to rise up and become an issue that's discussed with the project, and ultimately, potentially discussed at a board level about data quality if we have a lot of people exiting and we don't know where they went, especially for permanent housing programs. As you can imagine, we shouldn't be seeing a lot of unknown exits. Maintaining or increasing income. So did somebody at entry to annual assessment or entry to exit, depending on your program type, did they keep their income or increase their income? And I'm going to say this was one that I found quite a bit last year to be an issue with when folks are doing their annual assessments. And if you have questions about annual assessments, they then please come talk to our HMIS team, because we have some agencies that are doing poorly on this measure simply because they are not doing annual assessments at the right time. And if you're not sure, I would take a look at your APR and see what your data looks like. Because if you've got a lot of people who are missing data in the annual assessment criteria, you're going to have a big problem with this one. And then the last one is utilization of capacity, meaning if you've got 50 units in your project, are they full most of the time? The same is true of wrap rehousing, right? 50 households, whatever your capacity is. Are you keeping it relatively full, or do you have people enrolled regularly, or do you have a lot of vacancies and you're not refilling those vacancies? So we do look at whether or not you're utilizing the capacity of your program, and then the utilization of resources. So are you spending what you should spend? Are you using your funding appropriately? And that is the same thing. It's a points category that is also part of reallocation. So we're using the same data point. We're just using it in two different ways. All right, so then when we talk about our section on equity and representation, this I am 99% positive is exactly what you're going to be seeing, because this has been a part of the IRPA for quite a while. We're just clarifying language and making it easier for you to respond to these questions. This next section, I think, is going to involve more conversation with the committee. But again, we're seeing trends from HUD. HUD wants to see that we're asking projects these questions. And so we're trying to be responsive to that interest from HUD and to make sure we are, keeping up with the trends, being a forward-thinking COC board and COC project renewal process. So we could be looking at questions and data that are about whether or not we are ensuring that people with barriers to services, like a history of domestic violence, like severe mental health, like addictions, or co-occurring substance abuse, these are all probably people we're serving, right? But are we serving them in our programs? And essentially some amount of questions about, are we making sure that people with high barriers have access to housing? Don't know for sure on exactly the wording or what questions we're looking at, but my guess is we're going to be asking some questions about that. The other is whether or not we as a COC and even down to the project level are addressing disparities in housing outcomes, housing entry or exit outcomes, and whether or not we're ensuring representation of individuals with lived experience. So we've typically asked that lived experience question in a very specific way. We're looking at changing up that language to kind of be more in line with what HUD has been kind of asking about. And when we talk about disparity, my assumption is, based upon feedback that came through the strategic planning process, we're not only going to be talking about racial disparity. So if you are in a community and your project is in a community that doesn't have a lot of racial diversity, but you have other types of disparities in your community, maybe LGBTQ plus folks are not able to get housing in the same way, or other protected classes, families, individuals with severe mental health or chronic disease, whatever it might be. If you have disparities in your community, how does your project help to address them, or what are you looking at? Those kinds of questions are what I'm thinking we're going to end up at with the approved IRPA tool. But like I said, these are just drafted questions right now, and we're working on fine tuning what the question will exactly be. But we are looking at asking these kinds of questions, and in particular, changing up that lived experience, like board member, checkbox, to something a little bit more narrative, to kind of talk more about kind of what is going on, because beyond just having a board member representing that population, in the organization, are there other things that organizations are doing or should be doing to address, representation? Yeah, Pam, it's difficult, right? I think when I think of times we have folks who are exiting permanent housing to, homelessness, I think of folks who are, you're really struggling, right? I mean, that's somebody who maybe has refused services, who, this has been an agency you've tried time and time again, but, it's progressive engagement, it's housing first, it's all those things. So I agree. It's like tough to see or hear that, but, we see it. So it's definitely something we want to recognize and make sure that we're asking questions about as part of being responsive to that. Other information and points to know. If you have not already recently, or maybe you did as part of your closeout and then haven't looked at since, looked at your APR. I would pull an APR from Jan 1, 2022 to December 31, 2022. Sorry, there should be an extra 2 there. And take a look at what you've got there. I also want to let you know we are looking at making bonus points more like regular points. We are also looking at, because of some issues we've had in the last year in particular, where we had, to be quite honest, folks who were treating this ERPA process like a checkbox and were not spending any time making sure that what they were giving us was complete or accurate. It was not a good use of our funding and resource committee members' time to review bad applications. So we're trying to set more expectations there to say, if you fail to give us what we're asking you for in the way that we're asking you for it, there's going to be some consequence. Again, this is to address some very specific issues. So if this wasn't you, it wasn't you. And then also we're going to provide the score sheet in advance. We will have a specific training session on the ERPA. And I'm hoping for a more sophisticated online submission process than last year. So really looking forward to that. And we're going to look for opportunities to reduce extra documentation. If you are somebody who in the past has given us a copy of your APR that has been scanned onto a computer, printed out of Sage, we would really prefer you to use the APR report that comes out of HMIS in a PDF version. If you don't know how to get that, let us know. It's much easier to read. The charts are easier. It's just much easier for us. And we go back and check most of the data points. And so if we're spending a lot of time looking at and having to flip PDFs to make them right side up, it's just another step in the process that makes it more difficult for our reviewers, and they're all volunteers. So we, want to be cognizant of that. So just to kind of close this out, and I know I kind of left us with not a ton of time, so I apologize. This was a heavy one. I will send out this PowerPoint in a PDF form. If you have not taken a look at your APR since last year, these are the data points that report directly to the lines we're talking about. Some of this might be tweaked. I literally sat down with the HMIS team and we were counting in charts like 1, 2, 3, all the way to 43 and 41 at some points. So I'm almost positive these are right. We're close to right, but we will make sure the directions are very clear. And we're going to specify as clearly as you are looking for data point Q23C, line 43, or in the case of maintain or increase income, Q19A, column I, row 5. Like, we're going to tell you exactly where you should get that data point, which we hope will help improve, any errors that you might have found as you were checking our work and vice versa as we were checking yours when we were going through. But these are the data points. You'll get this in an email and be able to provide that. So I recognize I only left us with a minute for this. So if we need to schedule more time to talk this over, I'm happy to do it. And more than happy to do it. So does anybody have a question right now or any feedback that they have concerns about? Yeah, Mike?
Hi, Rachel. Hey, real quick question on the, understand looking at the grant inventory worksheet, going to eSnaps. What's the deadline so that I can help with the rest of my team on that?
Sure. So we, every year we hear that they're going to release the NOFO earlier, and every year it's sometime at the end of June, beginning of July. So my guess is we're going to do the ERPA process where you guys complete your renewal process before the NOFO drops so that you're not trying to do both at the same time and review the eSnaps. So my expectation is that sometime near the end of June through the middle point of July, we're going to be asking you to look at eSnaps. If related to the grant inventory worksheet, I would, and the COC program registration is due on Friday or Thursday. I can't remember. We already have it in, so we don't need to worry about it. That usually means that we're going to get a GIW within like 60 days. So I would anticipate us getting a grant inventory worksheet sometime in March or April. But last year, I think it came in July and changed like 3 times while we were reviewing it. So that's usually what we know, is that usually when it's, I don't know how many of you have been doing this a long time. Usually we get the GIW in the spring, the NOFO is in the summer to late summer. And then, we submit everything and we hear about the funding in December or January. It's obviously the end of February and we have not heard yet on last year. So that's my best guess.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I do want to hit on just one thing. And again, I would be more than happy if people want to really dive into some of this and really give feedback, set up a one-on-one time with you or set up another group call to talk about like, Rachel, I think that asking me about maintaining and increasing income is a bunch of malarkey. And I don't want to be asked that question. I want you to ask me about this instead. What I want to be able to do is take any of that feedback that you have and bring it to the board and have the board, our funding and resources committee, since it's been delegated to them, let them decide with that kind of information. We obviously can't let you all decide how you're going to be evaluated. I don't think HUD would be cool with that. But getting your feedback and your input into things is a part of this process that I think is really fair and can help make it better. So if there are things like that you want to talk about, again, happy to set up another call or more time to do that. And I'm so sorry I spent so long on the other sections, but it was a lot to get through today and I knew it was going to be close. So. All right, no one's hopping in and saying they have anything else, so I'm going to hop to the next section. So what's next? I would strongly encourage you to review your APR, your CAPER submission report, any data quality reports that you know about. I have a specific name of a data quality report that I'll be including in my follow-up email that our HMIS team has advised people is helpful. It allows you to look at the actual clients where there are potential data errors. So I think that would be great if you see you've got errors and you can click on a button and say, oh, it's these 3 people that are missing their birthday, like it's easy enough for you to do that. So look for an email from me, but if you already are, HMIS savvy or have somebody who is, I would encourage you to take a look at your APR with those dates in mind, that Jan 1 to December 31, and just make sure it looks right. Because if it looks wrong, then we want to get this fixed now. You don't want to be in the middle of the IRPA trying to fix, missing something or others. Address those data quality issues, review your fiscal year 2020 expenditures. I'm going to double check to make sure, as far as I know, that's our most recent closed out year. We do have some people who are still operating a fiscal year 2021 grant and, or have just closed it, like this month kind of thing. So we're trying to be fair and only use closed out funding evaluation. But I also know that can mean that was quite a while for some of you, which is a part, again, of what, when Kelly asked that question about what about COVID, like what about staffing issues or landlords, that's all a part of that conversation we have with anybody who is low on their spending. And then please reach out. Keep an eye on your email. Keep an eye on emails from me, me and Howard. We're going to continue to provide support and education through this process as we move into the actual IRPA itself. And if you don't understand something or you feel uncomfortable about a way we're evaluating projects, obviously I can't make changes once the IRPA is done. And I know I don't have like hard information to provide to you, but if any of these stuff we talked about today raises red flags, please let me know. So again, I can bring that concern to our committee and we can make sure we're being thoughtful about how we are asking questions and being cognizant of any concerns that you guys as recipients or subrecipients might have. That's all I got for today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. I appreciate your time and look for an email from me with a recording copy of this and more information. If anybody has any other topics they'd like to discuss, please reach out. Happy to host another one of these sessions or just, one-on-one time if it's just a special, project of yours that you're looking at. So appreciate it. Have a good one, guys.